Okay, we're going to look at farming turning into metallurgy. Part one, we're looking at how they were all hunter-gatherers and then turned into farmers, how most of it happened up in East Africa, and then there was other trade that came in, and how the cattle had actually come from Sumeria. And you'll even see the cattle in here, the Brahmin style of cattle that had come out of India. Bow Taurus and those and the grains they have and things too. And we'll talk some more about it as they go through, but it's going to talk about metallurgy, farming techniques starting to come in where you have to actually hoe the ground. And of course, Africa is extremely hard soiled without a lot of rain, and it's not a dark soil like up in Egypt is, where the fertile valleys of there and say Sumerian places would have been much more plowable, if you will. So let's look into this. This is a presentation done by Basil Davidson. Here they are trying to clear
While some peoples
ground.
continued to rely on livestock for their support, others turned to mixed farming. This cultivation of crops for food was the next long step forward in the history of Africa. South of the Sahara Desert and its nearby grassland plains, food growing began to make progress about 2,500 years ago.
So somewhere around 500 BC is whenever they first attained some type of farming and food cultivation. Other than that, it was opportunistic feeding. Sure, they had areas that were growing a lot of foods, and you'll see that coming up, which they actually consider farming too. But it's really just where things are growing in certain valleys, and they utilize it each year.
This led to a further increase in population and the establishment of village communities through vast areas of the continent.
And this equals out to like the Bantu expansion. Whenever archaeologists agree that there was a small, almost minute population of small tribal Africans or Negroids that were in Western and Sub-Saharan Africa, more on the West Coast area, not really down through the Cape and Point, and not into the Horn so much in earliest times. And what allowed this Bantu expansion was actually them bringing farming and cultivation and things. And it's an easy go on that. It seems to be what brought humanity itself to the rest of the civilized world, where the Sumerians and so on had brought in food and the ability to stay and develop a culture. And then also the same thing happened in Egypt and of course all into Europe and things, but they didn't have fertile valleys up in Egypt, in Europe. They ran off of river systems and so on. But yeah, so let's continue.
But the expansion of food growing called for another technological breakthrough. Simple kinds of tool could be good enough for cattle raising peoples. But when Africans embarked on tropical agriculture, which meant tree felling, clearing, hoeing, harvesting, they had to make more elaborate tools and stronger ones as well. That need brought about Africa's interest in metals, but above all in iron. An extensive and increasingly skilled African use of iron spread rapidly throughout the continent.
So shortly we're going to find out that his spread rapidly is actually going to be something that takes over 900 years to happen, and that it actually comes from North Africa, which would have been above the Sahara. Below the Sahara is considered central, and then you have Sub-Saharan and Cape form, Horn off to the right, and so on. But this is of the Nok culture, so let's look into this. This is some pottery that they had and so on. You can tell they had trade
This
contact.
terracotta head was made by the earliest iron-making culture so far known to have evolved south of the Sahara. The people and their culture are known by the name of the place where these relics of their skill were first discovered, in a village called Nok in central Nigeria.
It's N-O-K, but
Nok
yeah.
iron making began in about 500 BC. Other Iron Age cultures soon appeared in the same wide region, and this metallurgical skill, probably of northern African origin, then spread right across the continent, reaching the Transvaal in what is now South Africa by about 400 AD. That's
So we see here that he said that it came from North Africa, that it came from up here North Africa, and was given to them for trade into the Nok culture and so on. And here we're looking at Upper Egypt and Sudan, and of course the Nubians were taught to mine, and then taught to smelt, and then they would bring them tithings of metal and ingots and things like that. You don't see Nubians in any of the pictures carrying anything that contains metals, but surely they made things out of gold and so on like that. But then out of these two cultures, it seems to have spread down the rivers and into the other cultures, and then hopped into the middle area here during the time of the Islamic slave trade, which began about 900 years before the Americas were even found. And then at 400 AD, it creeps into sub-Saharan Africa here. And so it's not something that happens real rapidly, and indeed it takes twice the amount of time it seems to take the whole civilized world up there to go from a Bronze Age to an Iron Age, even though they have what's called the Bronze Age collapse in between the two. So it's not really that rapid of a thing, but again, to point out, he says it comes from North Africa. Let's go back, and I'm just going to repeat that here.
Nok iron making began in about 500 BC. Other Iron Age cultures soon appeared in the same wide region, and this metallurgical skill, probably of northern African origin.
Northern African origin. This is considered East African and North African. Egypt can be considered both, but this is North African. It's up on the coast, and all the people up here are Caucasians, and they had trading routes that they had come through supposedly and established all this. And of course, when you trade with people, you have to say, well, what do you got? What do I got? And they even could have taught them what they needed to get from each other. That's where it would probably come from, because the oddity of all of this is that Africa really doesn't have a Bronze Age. They don't even truly have a Stone Age. Whenever we ran into most of the people in the Cape area here in the Sub-Saharan and Ivory Coast, they were all in a pre-Stone Age level. They didn't have large stone buildings and set stone and things. They were running off of mud brick, and all of that looks like it was brought to them from the other people that came to them to colonize, if you will, and trade with them. And then later, it seems they didn't have perhaps anything of value except for ivory and the fact that they would capture and sell each other tribally to each other. And so they started funding the Islamic slave trade and selling their own people into slavery. And that's where that all comes in. Whenever we're looking at the Iron Age, we're looking at a three epoch system or whatever. So it's three ages. You have the Stone Age, known as Neolithic. You have the Bronze Age, and then it comes into the Iron Age. And Bronze Age, collapses 1150 to 1200 BC. It comes from the ancient Near East. It's Anatolia, Caucasus, Levant, ancient Europe, and so on. The Aegean collapses at these times. Here's the different times that they show here, but it's not really showing you Africa. It has its own thing because it has its own little asterisk next to it, and we'll look at that here in a second, though. But it's got, when you find the mere presence of cast or wrought iron, it's not sufficient to represent an Iron Age culture. Yet the term Iron Age sometime implies to the production of carbon steel. It's what it's supposed to be in mass producing tools and hardened steel forms and things like that. Whereas whenever you're just melting it out and smelting, and is what you're going to see here in a minute, that's not really considered to even truthfully be an Iron Age culture. Just like the Stone Age, the Neolithic is whenever they're actually not messing with stone, but they're making blocks of exact sizes and doing things with them and building and doing these type of things and making structures that are symmetrical and have a geometric shape to them, and all of these type of things that bring about math and all these other concepts that keep racing things through that aren't really evident in sub-Saharan African cultures and stuff. So looking at the Bronze Age collapse and stuff, and basically it looks like the Iron Age comes all the way through to the times of Herodotus. And funny how his name keeps coming up on a lot of these things, but at 800 AD would be the beginning of the Viking Age and the end of the Iron Age out of Scandinavian, Germanic area and far northern Europe and things. Well, but yet we're still somewhat in an Iron Age. Everything became a blend. You don't use iron for everything. So the extension of term of Iron Age and the archaeology of Southeast Asia is more recent, and maybe loosely in South Asia. The Iron Age is taken to begin with ironworking, painted grayware culture, and it's not necessarily even exactly what we actually use the same term for. So it's not well defined and maybe used more loosely, just like the Sahel and Sudan region and sub-Saharan Africa are outside of the three-age system, there being no Bronze Age, but the term Iron Age is sometimes used to refer to early cultures practicing ironworking, such as the Nok culture in Nigeria, but it wouldn't be the same type of Iron Age culture. They were smelting down iron and getting it to a raw form, but they weren't carbonizing it and turning it into steel and things like that until much later. And indeed, he just showed you 400 AD was whenever they were finally pulling off that type of endeavor. So here's a little timeline up top, and you can see that the Bronze Age starts at roughly 3000, 3200, and it goes on through. And if you want to look up the Iron Age, I mean, you literally can just go here and go to Iron Age on Wiki, and it's going to tell you a lot of information. You can, of course, study much deeper than this, but none of this seems to be out of order in any way, shape, or form. Though the guy whose show that we were watching is somewhat of an Afrocentricist, and he's a studier of there. It's what he specializes in. And if you really pay attention and watch the whole show instead of what I just show you there, you'll see him contradict himself by a couple of 100 years, a couple of times, and a few other things. I quite often don't add the BC and not in, so whenever something's 1200 years ago, I'll say 1200 BC. Usually I'll correct myself on that, because 1200 years ago is 800 AD, or a little more now. But yeah, anyhow, so we're looking at carbon content and stuff, and a lot of the earliest stuff that they found, here's the people with ferrous metallurgy. So you have ancient Near East and the Aegean, Italy, Southeast Asia, Roman and Europe, and all the way through to the Viking times, and you can see all this. But what's missing off this is Africa itself, and the Mediterranean area is considered to be different. The Levant and Mediterranean, even North Africa, has got to be looked at as being different because of the separation of the Sahara and things that happen like that. So your first, Bronze Age type thing that you may find look like they were from meteors, and they had taken meteors and heated them up. And the idea here is that they didn't have smelting ability in the kilns to be able to get up to the heat. They would actually turn iron into a molten form where you could pour and cast it. But that's because they had their furnaces set up for bronze and copper and bronze casting, and which only had to get up to about 1600 degrees. And therefore, whenever they get things up to that, you still get a red hot metal, and you see ironsmiths working with it all the time. So they had taken and would get a chunk of meteorite and put it in a smelter and get it to where it was red hot, and then start pounding it and working it from there. And one of the neatest artifacts that you find in Egypt is indeed a actual meteorite iron dagger. I did a video on it a long time ago, and it's mentioned in a couple of my other ones, but oh hell, let's take a look at it right now. So Tutankhamun's meteoric iron dagger, here it is here on the side, and you can tell it's been folded and worked almost like a an Asian sword or a katana, and it's got a sheath with it that's a solid gold sheath that's been worked out, that's real pretty and kind of ornamental. A silver tang on the bottom of it, gemstones built into it, and so on. And this is really somewhat ceremonial. You can tell it's not something to be used all the day, but it was also looked at as being some type of real artifact thing that had been kept and then sacredly buried with him. Now, you know, people back then thought, and still to this day, we have the expression that whenever a meteorite falls or we see a falling star, that that would be it. Well, they thought that this was star metal, it was sacred, and so it was, you know, it's from the stars. Well, the stars and planets were gods, so this was something the gods gave them. So when you hear the story that the gods gave them metalworking, you're like, oh, huh? You know, so I don't know how the gods gave them the plow and that works out like this, but you can see where the falling star and then finding a meteorite and so on, because it has the nickel content and a little bit of cobalt in it, and it seems to be within the ranges, although people have argued they've been able to make metal that had a nickel ore combination that exactly mimics within these ranges, that actually doesn't have anything to do with meteorite. It's made out of modern metals and stuff, and just by smelting it from certain places that you get rocks from. But so this, you know, it looks like it was a royal gift during the time or preceding Tutankhamun's rule. In other words, like back in Amenhotep III, somewhere around in that time. And from the group from before that, and that they had gotten a hold of a large chunk of meteorite, pieces of meteorite or something, and had done this out of it, or a different culture like the Mitanni or somebody had done so. And indeed, they thought that the Hittites or somebody had probably made this thing because they didn't have the capability. Thinking through it, they may have had the capability to heat it up and smelt it, or heat it up and beat it into shape and so on. But it's kind of neat. But let's go back. In fact, we're looking here at the Iron Age thing. So there's different cultures here that you can go: ancient Near East, Western Asia, so on, all the way through Egypt. Here they talk about different places that they have, and that they have found a sword bearing the name of Meneptah, as well as a battle axe with an iron blade. Decorated bronze shaft were both found in the excavation of Ugarit, way up there in the Levant there. Dagger with an iron blade in Tutankhamun's from 1300 BC. So, and they think that's meteorific origin and so on like that. Whenever you get down to sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, they have even this rusted out type iron suit that they have. In sub-Saharan Africa here, they have what they show is the diaspora down here in the green area, not connected to North Africa, of its spread, and they'll tell you here that it corresponds to the first millennium Bantu expansion, and so 250 BC, 300, 300, 300, and 400. So it finally, built in there. They finally got the metallurgy going on to that level there. So the oddity there is that there was no continental-wide universal Bronze Age. The use of iron succeeded immediately the use of stone, and they didn't really have great stonework. It was really just brickwork and things like that. They find, Nubia has some going on, but that's from their attachment in the Ethiopian area of Egypt that they had them mining for themselves too in that time. But down deep, it doesn't look like they had that concept going on at all.
Then spread right across the continent, reaching the Transvaal in what is now South Africa by about 400 AD. That's 1500 years ago.
But it's about
These iron-making
1,000 years later than most people.
Regional differences.
Brought
But the
to
people
them.
of Sukur on the border of Nigeria and Cameroon can illustrate the vital importance of iron to community development. A man and his two wives go out to harvest their crop of guinea corn. Also known as sorghum, guinea corn is a valued food crop, and iron tools enormously helped in its cultivation.
Now, guinea corn, or what they call sorghum, and there's a Sudan version, sorghum Sudan, where they've hybrid this, and this is a modern genetic form, is what we use to feed cattle with. It's what hay bales and things are made out of. Now they'll take the little seed millet off the top of it and use it, but it's considered to be a bird millet. But so they'll eat that and they'll use the other parts and stalks and make things out of it, and perhaps even eat some of it. But it's really considered to be hay.
The farmer and his wives are working on a terrace of land literally carved from the hillside by the use of iron hoes.
There's the millet on top.
Iron knives and sickles sever the heads of the grain. All these tasks were much more laborious before the invention of iron. And having solved the problems of growing food where food had never been grown before,
Now, he said that, but before that, the Egyptians have some incredible knives that are sharper than a lot of metal knives can keep and attain. They had to have obsidian, and you shatter a piece off of it, and it's so sharp, man, it'll just go right through things like butter. And that's what they had used. And indeed, the first sickles and things they had things like that attached to them, and that they were using pieces like that before them for them. We find Neolithic stuff where it shows that, going all the way back to, I believe, a site at 38,000 years BC.
people like these were able to form permanent settlements. Gradually, their farmers could produce enough food to support craftsmen such as blacksmiths, traders, and priests. And as their society became more complex, they began to feel the need for some kind of centralized government. Their priests became kings, small kings at first, but the kings accumulated power to themselves, whether to make war or to gain privilege.
We was kings. No, so it seems like the priest would try to rule the society, and indeed, when you look at Sumeria, there was the priest kings that started it all off. First, there was divinity, then there was priest kings, and then there's a separation of kings and the
The king
societies.
Sukur had only small political power, secular power, but he drew added strength and prestige from his people's belief that their king spoke with the spiritual power of God. The king of Sukur had the power on behalf of his people to intercede with the one God who's above all the other gods in Sukur religion.
Now, we want to point this out that their religion is not the Hebrew Bible, doesn't involve anybody, any of the stories, any of the name. In fact, Negroes aren't mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. It's the black people in America have adopted the Caucasian religion that they're hanging around with now. Of course, this religion is totally different.
He was believed to be able to persuade God to favor his people, send increase to their crops, and give fertility to their women. And God, when answering these requests, gave instructions to the king on how best his people should behave. Not surprisingly, God and the king seldom disagreed.
And that would make sense, seeing as how he was speaking for God. And you can see how this emanates from other cultures too. But gullible people can believe a lot of things. And when you're looking at something like this, knowing what the Caucasians had been through a long, long time ago, this shows you kind of them going through their own little mocking or mimicking of that style and bringing it through. And it's not something we're looking back at thousands of years ago happening, but it's evident right now and today where you can see these people. And odd, whenever he gives his prophetic thing that makes the other guy happy, he makes a hell of a noise here. I like Stevie Wonder and harmonica a little better, but yeah.
Sukur economy consists of an intricate complex of productive activities. Just like the Pokot, people here developed a balance with nature. And this enabled them to profit from nature's gifts without undermining the ecology of the land on which they've depended for centuries.
That is a hunter-gatherer way. They're not changing the land in any way. They're doing it. They're basically living as hunter-gatherers right now. She's knocking down with a stick nuts out of a tree.
And still
So,
depend
of course,
today.
that still can happen in any society, but
Once a food
just
surplus
pointing that
became
out.
possible, a section of the population could be released from the daily need to produce crops and could develop specialist crafts.
Like making their dung huts or baskets.
In a division of labor,
Or,
women could make pots and men could weave baskets.
yeah, see?
A sharper division of labor has also developed within Sukur society. Certain crafts have long been practiced by a particular group of men and women called the Nkyagu. In the old days, Nkyagu were not expected to do any farming. Instead, they could give all their working time to this or that special craft, making goods for sale or barter in exchange for food.
So this is what they would trade and barter with people once they became part of the trade. They were told what they needed and what they didn't need. You could make us pots, you can make us baskets, you can do this, that, and the other. We'll trade you food for baskets, grains, things like that, perhaps plants.
Nowadays, the old customs have begun to disappear. In
Seed.
time, no doubt, corrugated iron will displace the woven roofs of the granaries.
So still living in a wicker basket world and stuff, and very third world country. These don't look too much different than a lot of Asian type style huts and things like that, except for they have palm fold over so they don't leak at all. It doesn't rain here enough to have developed that. You can probably see in the picture where she's on the inside there putting all this reed through, and you can see little vents through there. Well, it allows air to come through somewhat and a little bit of light, and it would allow rain to come right through, but it doesn't rain there very much. It's not the real concern where it would be on a tropical island. So in environments too, certain types or aspects of evolution of concept won't ever show themselves. Like in a slightly arid or desert environment, you won't find a hermetically sealing waterproofing concept because they don't have to go against it. It would probably be something much more coastal and or exposed to a lot of rains and monsoons and all kinds of things like that, which Africa could sure use quite a few come through. In fact, a hurricane looked at as being a terrible thing usually if it swept into their coast real hard and brought a bunch of rain across the planet would really, or across the continent, would really help things quite a bit. If they could just get it to not hit land near any city, bam, it would really help out. Strangely, they whip and come in America and get pulled into the Caribbean, usually, or up the eastern seaboard. Anyhow, so I just thought I'd look into that and show you this metallurgy thing. And
As the Sukur grew more prosperous and embarked on trade with their neighbors, their chiefs ordered the building of a stone roadway more than 3 miles long down to the valley below. And in a society as stable as this, with its regular food supply, specialization could extend beyond the practice of crafts into what we would call the professions. This man is a traditional doctor.
a witch doctor.
A patient has been brought to him, suffering from a severely sprained ankle and quite unable to walk. With a combination of herbal remedies and a robust but carefully practiced manipulation, the healer will try to get the patient back on his feet again.
Oh no, he's going to hyperstrain that thing or something. He's going to tear tendons if he doesn't watch it.
Such treatment is really a form of physiotherapy. And no matter what the pain, the patient has faith in his doctor. And this element of faith has always played an important part in African medical treatment.
Yeah, it's like faith healing, and you think somebody does some magic thing, and they go woo woo woo, and they burn something, and you think it's going to fix you. But there's nothing been done to you. In this case, he's here twisting and contorting and pushing on this guy's ankle, and acting like he's doing something right. First, he spit on this stuff and put it on his ankle, and he's telling you, "I'm Dr. Wabi, I'm right." And this shit hurts. Looking and reaching for him like, stop that shit. So now the doctor finally quits, and then he does this other manipulation like he's done something.
The psychological dimension in African healing is now increasingly recognized by doctors throughout the world as a serious and valid aspect of curative medicine.
That's not a correct statement, really. It doesn't come from there. The idea of that is placebo. Placebo is whenever you take a drug that doesn't do anything. Say I was to give you an aspirin and say it was going to do this to you, and you would have a psychological effect. They've even given people sugar pill and said that it'll lower their blood pressure, and they noticeably have a slightly lower average blood pressure across 100 people they try it with and stuff. And it's an effect that works on people. You know, a doctor looks you over and tells you, hey, you're okay. I checked you all out, checked your blood work, you're okay. It makes you feel okay because you were kind of worried. If they give you an answer to your ailment and something that's actually going to fix you, then that fixes you. There's nothing that he can do short of attempting surgery, which would be a nightmare on this guy. So all he can really do is twist around his ankle and act like he's a sports medicine doctor. Going to give him a little therapy here. Now the guy is supposed to try to walk again. But it's really just a psychological thing, just like the witch doctor effect, where if you believe in something, you know, and that's not a correct thing. That doesn't bear on science, really. He's going to try to put weight back on it again, and he might be able to get walking here in the next few days. Of course, with that sprained ankle, he probably would have had the same effect. It doesn't look swollen, so he should be all right, and he's going to hobble off here. And now the witch doctor thinks he did something. Here we have metallurgy.
The decisive skill on which the whole of Sukur society depended was the smelting and smithing of iron. This is a traditional blast furnace, one of the last surviving examples of the process of metallurgy evolved in Africa more than 2,000 years ago.
Now, it looks like he's beating drums up there, but what he's actually doing is...
The use of a double bellows forces a blast of air into the heart of the furnace. This blast, or forced draft, was necessary in order to reach the very high temperature required to smelt iron ore.
He's got two windbags, and he's hitting each one back and forth. Now, it's really an improper technique. What we do here in Europe and the West was you push on one, you suck on the other, you push on one, suck on the other, and we get this big bellows going, and it forces a lot of air. He's just going like that, and it doesn't quite do it, and you'll never reach the highest temperatures doing it, but you can get it going. You'll see this thing. They get the iron to pretty much become molten. They don't get it molten, they get it to where it's red hot. Yellow hot, not white hot, not melting. That's that pumping noise.
Smelting is complete within about 2 hours of reaching the necessary temperature, and the furnace can be carefully opened.
Now you hear him slowing down, and you can see it puffing with his puffs. It should be bigger puffs with bigger bags. Now you can hear him throwing water on it, and listen to it sear.
Molten iron is gradually revealed.
It's hot. It's over 2,000 degrees in there. It's going to rapidly cool now, though, but that chunk of metal isn't, of course. They have to bring it out, and probably it'll take days for it to cool if they don't put it in water. So they put it in water, steep it.
Once cooled and broken into small bits, the product goes to a second stage in the foundry process, the blacksmith's forge. And this is where the professionals, the Nkyagu blacksmiths, begin their work.
There he is, beating those things too fast. If he'd make them a little bigger, he could go forceful and stronger, bigger drums, you know, like bellows. Here they are working some of it.
With
And
repeated heating and hammering, the iron is pounded to remove impurities. The glowing lump is reduced to a bar of solid metal, a simple form of steel.
so this is foundering it and stuff, but they don't really steep it and carbonize it like they should. And in that effect too, it's not really a true steel form, although they are now getting there. Now we're looking at modern. But
Although it's slow and arduous, this technology was sufficient to meet old Africa's demand for metal tools. Perhaps more than any other, this was the inventive development, the key that enabled Africans to solve the problems of creating permanent villages.
indeed, it could have helped quite a bit, but it wasn't their innovation, and they were one of the last people to figure it out. And it looked like it was brought to them by people that were asking them to smelt and do this, and you trade us iron bars like this bar is making right here. We'll give you food for iron bars. We'll give you cows for, and things like that. And the permanent village effect comes from that, and then them being able to sustain. See, before the Bantu expansion, it's looked at it that they never really had any large tribal areas, just small groups together. They couldn't sustain more than a little over 100 people in a group of being hunter-gatherers. Europeans couldn't really either, unless you get a valley situation where you had groups all up the valley, kind of like this block, that block, that block, that block, going down river valleys and things and so on like that. But it'll choke out a river system, and then if we're eating all the fish, who gets the ones below it? Is there any for them? And all these things come into effect. I don't want to go there on this, but so this iron effect that you see here, their bellows and them making this smelting is happening around 400 AD, and up into the modern age here, they're still pulling off iron implements, and they're still now considered somewhat an Iron Age people that never validly experienced a Stone Age and never ever experienced a Copper and Bronze Age. But now they're in the modern age, and without ever experiencing the other ones, and now they're into a space age that's surrounding them of humanity, and I think they're just quite outclassed quite a bit. They have new clothes on, but that's about it. Anyhow, guys, it's a Basil Davidson presentation. You might look into it.